At my promotion celebration, my team announced they were all quitting. I stood up and revealed. The wine glass felt steady in my hand when Stephanie raised hers and cleared her throat to get everyone's attention. We were sitting in the private dining room at Bellissimo, the upscale Italian restaurant downtown where my company had reserved space for 20 people to celebrate my promotion to Vice President of Business Development. My colleagues from other departments were still congratulating me on the announcement our CEO had made an hour earlier about my new role and the division I'd be leading. Stephanie was my senior account manager, the person I'd hired 5 years ago, fresh out of business school and mentored into one of the top performers in the company. She stood there in her navy blazer looking confident and professional, and when the room quieted down, she said, "David, we're all so happy for your success, but we need to share something important with everyone here tonight." She gestured to the table where my entire 6-person team sat together. Kyle, my operations director, Trent, my lead strategist, Vanessa, my client relations manager, Nicole, my marketing coordinator, and Justin, my junior account executive. They all stood up in unison like they'd rehearsed it, which they had. Stephanie continued, "Effective 2 weeks from today, all 6 of us will be resigning from the company to pursue other opportunities. We wanted to tell you tonight so you could start planning for the transition." The room went silent. My boss, Kenneth, looked shocked. The HR director went pale, and I sat there watching my entire team smile at me like they'd just done me a favor when I knew exactly what they were really doing. They were launching the startup they'd been planning for 8 months to steal my clients, my strategies, and everything I'd built. And they had no idea I'd known about it for the past 11 weeks. I'd been building the business development division for 6 years, starting as a senior manager and growing it from 3 people and $12 million in annual revenue to a team of 7, generating $48 million annually. I'd hired every single person on my team personally, trained them in my methodologies, shared my client relationships with them, and given them opportunities I'd never had at their career stage. Stephanie had been my first major hire, brought on when she'd had only 2 years of experience, but had shown exceptional strategic thinking during her interview. I'd spent months teaching her my approach to client development and relationship management. Within 3 years, she'd been managing our 5 largest accounts and earning close to $130,000 annually. Kyle had come from a manufacturing background, and I'd retrained him completely in our service-based business model. Trent had been a consultant who'd wanted to get out of the travel grind, and I'd created a strategy position specifically for him. Vanessa had been working retail management when I'd hired her based on her interpersonal skills and taught her everything about client relations. Every single one of them had been shaped by my training, my networks, and my reputation in the industry. The company had rewarded my success by promoting me steadily, from senior manager to director to associate vice president, and now to vice president with equity stake and a seat on the executive leadership team. The promotion had come with a salary increase from $160,000 to $225,000 plus performance bonuses and stock options. I'd been thrilled and had wanted to celebrate with the team that had made it possible. I'd requested this dinner specifically to thank them and share the news that my promotion meant budget increases for their salaries and the ability to hire 3 more people. I'd been planning to announce raises for each of them, averaging 15%. Instead, I was sitting here watching them execute the first phase of what they thought was a brilliant plan to leave and start a competing firm using everything they'd learned from me. What they didn't know was that I discovered their plan back in January when I'd accidentally seen an email on Stephanie's computer during a client meeting. We'd been at a client site doing a quarterly review presentation, and Stephanie had been controlling the laptop connected to the projector. She'd minimized our presentation to check something, and for about 5 seconds before she'd realized the screen was still projecting, an email had been visible. The subject line had read, "LLC formation documents ready for review," and the preview text had mentioned something about partnership percentages and non-compete strategies. She'd closed it quickly and had seemed flustered, claiming it was personal business. I'd nodded and we'd continued the meeting, but my stomach had already dropped. LLC formation, partnership percentages, non-compete strategies. Those weren't phrases that appeared in personal emails. Those were business terms. After the meeting, I'd spent the drive back to the office thinking about other small details I'd been dismissing as coincidence. The way my team had started having lunch meetings without me about twice a week for the past few months. The way Stephanie and Kyle had been taking calls outside the office more frequently. The way Trent had been asking unusually specific questions about our client contracts and how renewal clauses worked. The way Vanessa had been making copies of client contact databases and strategic planning documents. I'd been attributing it all to them becoming more independent and taking initiative. Now I was wondering if it was something else entirely. If you are enjoying this story already, please subscribe to see more stories like this. I'd gone home that night and had sat in my home office just thinking through the implications. If my team was planning to leave and start their own firm, they'd need clients. Our clients. They'd need methodologies and strategies. My methodologies and strategies. They'd need industry connections and reputation, which they'd built entirely through association with me. The more I'd thought about it, the more furious I'd become. Not just at the betrayal, but at the sheer audacity of it. I'd given these people careers. I'd shared everything I knew with them. I'd put my reputation on the line to get them opportunities and promotions. And they were planning to take everything I'd taught them and use it to compete against me. But fury wasn't useful without proof. I'd needed to know for certain what they were planning before I could do anything about it. So the next morning, I'd called the only person I knew I could trust completely, without question. My older brother, Thomas, who worked as a corporate attorney specializing in employment law and trade secrets litigation. He'd been practicing for 19 years and had seen every version of employee theft and corporate espionage imaginable. Thomas had listened to everything without interrupting, then had asked me pointed questions. Had I seen any other evidence besides that one email? Did our employment contracts have non-compete clauses? Did we have confidentiality agreements covering client information and business strategies? What level of access did my team have to proprietary systems and data? I'd answered each question, and Thomas had been quiet for a moment before telling me I had a serious problem. If my team was planning to leave and start a competing business, and they'd been working at our company while planning it, they were potentially violating their employment agreements and possibly engaging in theft of trade secrets. But without proof, I couldn't do anything except watch them walk out the door with everything they'd learned. Thomas had said I needed documentation, evidence of planning, evidence of taking confidential information, evidence of soliciting clients while still employed. He'd given me the name of a digital forensics specialist named Rachel Dennison, who'd been doing corporate investigations for 16 years. He'd said Rachel could help me understand what was happening on company systems and whether there was evidence of wrongdoing. I'd thanked him and had called Rachel that afternoon. Rachel had been professional and direct. She'd explained that as an executive with authority over my team, I had legal right to monitor company systems and communications for business purposes. If my team was using company equipment and email to plan a competing venture, that was discoverable. She'd quoted me a rate of $200 per hour and had said a comprehensive investigation would probably run between $15,000 and $25,000, depending on what she found. I'd authorized it immediately. I'd had the budget as a senior leader, and this was worth every penny. Rachel had come to our office the following Monday posing as an IT consultant doing a routine security audit. She'd spent 3 days imaging hard drives, copying email servers, and analyzing network traffic. What she'd found had been even worse than I'd feared. My entire team had been planning their departure for 8 months. 8 months of emails, shared documents, meeting notes, and strategic planning all conducted using company resources and company time. Rachel had compiled everything into a detailed forensic report with exhibits and timestamps. The evidence had shown that Stephanie and Kyle had registered an LLC called Apex Strategic Solutions back in September, 4 months before I'd accidentally seen that email. All 6 members of my team were listed as partners with varying equity stakes. Stephanie held 30% as managing partner. Kyle had 25%. The others had smaller percentages. They'd been meeting every other week at a coffee shop across town to plan their business strategy, and they'd been documenting everything in shared Google Docs accessed from company computers. The documents had included a client target list that was literally our current client roster. They'd identified which clients they thought they could convince to switch to their new firm, and they'd assigned relationship managers to each account. Vanessa had been tasked with downloading our entire client contact database. Trent had been documenting all of our strategic frameworks and methodologies. Nicole had been collecting marketing materials and branding assets. Justin had been compiling pricing models and proposal templates. They'd been systematically copying everything proprietary about our business development approach. Even more damning, the emails had shown them explicitly discussing how to avoid legal liability. There had been threads about waiting until after their employment ended to formally solicit clients, so they couldn't be accused of doing it while still employed with us. Discussions about how to phrase their pitches to clients to make it seem like the clients were initiating the relationship rather than being poached. Strategies for arguing that the methodologies they'd use weren't trade secrets, but just general business knowledge. They'd been trying to stay just inside legal boundaries while planning to gut my division. Rachel's report had also revealed financial planning documents showing they'd been projecting revenue of $35 million in their first year, based on converting about 70% of our current client base. They'd been assuming most clients would follow them because of their relationships, not understanding that those relationships existed because of the foundation I'd built. The timeline in their planning documents had shown they'd intended to resign in April, give 2 weeks' notice, and launch their new firm in May, right as several of our major contracts came up for renewal. They'd been planning to time it perfectly to cause maximum damage. I'd read through Rachel's 238-page forensic report over a weekend in late January, and I'd felt something shift inside me. The initial hurt and betrayal had hardened into cold, calculated determination. They'd been planning this for months while looking me in the eye every day, attending my training sessions, sitting in my strategy meetings, and pretending to be loyal team members. They'd been stealing from me systematically while I'd been working to get them raises and promotions. The level of deception was breathtaking. But they'd also made critical mistakes. They'd documented everything on company systems. They'd used company time and resources to build their competing business. They'd created a clear evidentiary trail of their intentions and actions. And they'd underestimated me completely. They'd thought I wouldn't notice or wouldn't figure it out until after they'd left. They'd thought I'd be helpless to stop them. They'd been wrong on both counts. I'd called Thomas back and had sent him Rachel's complete forensic report. He'd reviewed it and had called me 2 days later sounding energized. He'd said the evidence was comprehensive and damning. My team had clearly violated their employment agreements, their confidentiality obligations, and potentially several trade secret statutes. Thomas had recommended I bring in an attorney who specialized in trade secret litigation and injunctive relief to develop a legal strategy. He'd given me the name of Lawrence Fisher, a partner at one of the top business litigation firms in the state, who'd been practicing intellectual property and trade secret law for 22 years. I'd met with Lawrence in his downtown office on a Friday afternoon in early February. His office had been exactly what you'd expect from a senior litigation partner. Floor-to-ceiling windows, expensive furniture, walls covered in framed victories, and bar admissions from multiple states. Lawrence had been in his early 50s, gray hair, sharp eyes, and the confident demeanor of someone who'd won more cases than he'd lost. I'd given him the complete background and Rachel's forensic report. He'd spent an hour reviewing the key exhibits before looking up at me and saying this was one of the clearest cases of trade secret misappropriation he'd seen in recent years. The fact that my team had documented their planning so thoroughly while using company resources made it almost indefensible. Lawrence had explained my options methodically. I could confront them immediately and demand they cease their planning, but that would likely just drive it underground, and I'd lose the element of surprise. I could wait for them to resign and then sue them, but by then they might have already taken clients and caused irreversible damage. Or I could let them execute their plan while documenting everything, then hit them with legal action at the moment of maximum impact. Lawrence had recommended the third option. Let them think they were getting away with it while building an airtight legal case, then strike when they were most vulnerable and exposed. The strategy had appealed to me for multiple reasons. If I confronted them early, they'd lawyer up and stop documenting their activities. If I let them proceed, they'd continue creating evidence and would be so confident in their plan that they wouldn't see the trap closing around them. Lawrence had outlined what we'd need to do. Continue monitoring their activities through Rachel's forensic work. Document every instance of them accessing confidential information or using company resources for their venture. Prepare a comprehensive complaint for trade secret misappropriation, breach of fiduciary duty, and breach of contract. Draft temporary restraining orders and preliminary injunctions to prevent them from using any of the stolen information or contacting our clients. And prepare a damages analysis showing the financial harm they'd cause if allowed to execute their plan. Lawrence had estimated the full legal package would cost around $75,000 to prepare and another $100,000 to $150,000 to litigate if it went to trial. I'd authorized everything. This wasn't about the money. This was about protecting what I'd built and making sure there were consequences for betrayal. Over the next 3 months, Rachel had continued monitoring my team's activities while I'd pretended everything was normal. It had been the most difficult acting job of my life, sitting in team meetings while they'd reported on client activities, knowing they were planning to steal those same clients, conducting performance reviews and discussing career development while they'd been counting down the days until they'd leave, sharing strategic insights and methodologies while they'd been documenting everything to use against me. Every interaction had felt like a performance, and I'd had to be perfect. One slip, one moment where I'd revealed I knew, and the whole thing would have collapsed. Rachel's ongoing monitoring had revealed more damning evidence. In March, Stephanie had met with 2 of our clients during lunch hours and had discussed future opportunities for collaboration. The implication had been clear, even though she'd been careful not to explicitly solicit them. Kyle had been having weekly calls with a business banker about securing a line of credit for Apex Strategic Solutions, and he'd been using our client list and revenue projections as evidence of their business potential. Trent had compiled a complete playbook of our strategic frameworks and had shared it with the other partners. They'd been getting bolder and sloppier as their launch date had approached. In late March, my promotion to vice president had been announced internally. The executive team had called me into a meeting and had told me about the new role, the salary increase, the equity stake, everything. They'd asked me to keep it quiet for 2 weeks until they could coordinate the public announcement and reorganization. I'd agreed, and I'd immediately realized this promotion changed everything. My team's plan had been based on the assumption that I'd remain in my current role, managing the division they'd be competing against. They hadn't anticipated me being elevated to VP level with broader authority and resources. When the promotion had been announced publicly in mid-April, I'd watched my team's reactions carefully during the company-wide meeting. Stephanie had looked surprised and slightly concerned. Kyle and Trent had exchanged glances. They'd known this complicated their strategy, but they'd apparently decided to proceed anyway. Their resignation timeline had been set for the following week during this celebration dinner. Lawrence had said the timing was actually perfect for our purposes. They'd be resigning right after I'd received a major promotion, which would make their betrayal even more egregious and would demonstrate clear intent to harm the company at a vulnerable transition moment. If this story keeps your interest, please subscribe to get more stories like this. The week before the dinner, I'd met with Lawrence and Rachel to finalize everything. Lawrence had prepared a 60-page complaint detailing every instance of trade secret misappropriation, breach of fiduciary duty, breach of confidentiality agreements, and breach of contract. The complaint had included hundreds of exhibits from Rachel's forensic investigation: emails, documents, meeting notes, client lists, strategic frameworks, financial projections, all of it. Lawrence had also prepared temporary restraining order applications that would immediately prevent my team from using any confidential information, contacting any of our clients, or operating their competing business pending a full hearing. He'd arranged for emergency filing the moment they formally resigned, which would catch them completely off guard. Rachel had prepared a supplemental forensic report documenting their activities through the most recent day, showing continued access to confidential systems and continued planning activities using company resources right up until the end. We'd been ready. All I'd had to do was wait for them to make their move. The celebration dinner had been scheduled for Thursday evening at Bellissimo. The company had invited my team, my boss Kenneth, the CEO, the HR director, and several colleagues from other departments. 20 people total in a private dining room. I'd known Stephanie planned to announce the mass resignation during the dinner based on an email Rachel had intercepted where she'd discussed making the announcement during David's celebration so we can do it professionally in front of leadership. She'd actually thought announcing a coordinated resignation at my promotion dinner was professional. The audacity was remarkable. I'd arrived at the restaurant at 6:30 and everyone had been in good spirits. Cocktails, appetizers, congratulations all around. The CEO had given a speech about my contributions to the company and my vision for the business development division's future. People had toasted and applauded. I'd given a brief thank you speech, keeping it gracious and humble. Then dinner had been served, and around 7:45, Stephanie had stood up with her wine glass and made her announcement. The mass resignation, effective in 2 weeks, other opportunities, all delivered with a smile like she was doing everyone a favor. The room had gone silent. My boss Kenneth had looked like he'd been punched. The CEO's expression had shifted from shock to barely controlled anger. The HR director had immediately started taking notes, probably already thinking about legal implications. And I'd sat there watching my team stand together in their little solidarity moment, so proud of themselves for executing their plan. I'd let the silence stretch for about 10 seconds before I'd stood up, set down my wine glass, and said, "Before we discuss transitions, I need to share something important with everyone here as well." I'd pulled out my phone and had opened the email app where I'd had Lawrence's message queued up ready to forward. About 3 months ago, I discovered that my entire team has been planning to leave and start a competing firm called Apex Strategic Solutions. They've been using company time, company resources, and company systems to plan this venture for approximately 8 months. They've been systematically copying confidential client information, proprietary strategic methodologies, and trade secrets with the intention of using them to solicit our clients and compete against us. The room had erupted. Kenneth had started asking questions. The CEO had leaned forward with intensity. My team's faces had gone from confident to pale. Stephanie had tried to interrupt, saying, "That's not true. We've been planning this on our own time." I'd held up my hand. "I have comprehensive forensic evidence documenting every aspect of your planning, all conducted using company equipment and during work hours. I have emails, shared documents, meeting notes, client target lists, copied databases, strategic frameworks, and financial projections. All of it obtained through legal monitoring of company systems by a certified digital forensics investigator. I've had corporate attorneys reviewing this evidence for 3 months, and as of 1 hour ago, they filed a lawsuit against all 6 of you for trade secret misappropriation, breach of fiduciary duty, and breach of contract." I'd forwarded Lawrence's email to Kenneth, the CEO, and the HR director. Their phones had buzzed simultaneously. "You'll each be served with legal papers tomorrow morning. The complaint details every instance of you accessing confidential information, copying proprietary materials, and planning to use company resources for personal benefit. We're also filing for immediate temporary restraining orders, preventing you from using any confidential information, contacting any of our clients, or operating your competing business pending a full hearing. That hearing is scheduled for next Wednesday morning at 9 a.m. in front of Judge Barbara Thornton. You're welcome to bring your attorneys." The silence was absolute. Stephanie's hands were shaking. Kyle had sat down heavily. Trent looked like he might be sick. Vanessa was staring at the table. Nicole was crying quietly. Justin looked terrified. I'd continued, "Your resignations are accepted effective immediately as of this moment. You're no longer employees of this company. Security will meet you at the office tomorrow morning to collect your credentials, company property, and to supervise your collection of personal items. You're prohibited from accessing any company systems, contacting any clients, or discussing any company business. All of that is detailed in the restraining order applications you'll receive tomorrow." Kenneth had found his voice and had asked how long I'd known. I'd told him about discovering it in January and immediately hiring investigators and attorneys to document everything. The CEO had asked if the evidence was solid, and I'd said it was comprehensive and indisputable. We had 8 months of documented planning, hundreds of emails, copied files, and forensic proof of everything. The HR director had asked if I'd notified them earlier, and I'd explained that my attorneys had recommended letting the situation develop to gather complete evidence rather than driving it underground. Everyone had understood. This wasn't just employees leaving. This was systematic theft and betrayal that required a complete legal response. I'd looked at my former team and had said, "You spent 8 months planning to destroy everything I built and steal from this company. You thought I wouldn't notice or wouldn't be able to stop you. You thought you could smile at me every day while planning to betray me, and there would be no consequences. You were wrong." Stephanie had tried one more time to salvage something. "We have a right to start our own business. You can't stop us from working." I'd nodded. "You absolutely have the right to start your own business. What you don't have the right to do is steal trade secrets, breach your confidentiality agreements, and plan that business using your employer's resources while still employed. The lawsuit isn't about you leaving. It's about how you left and what you took with you." Lawrence had structured the legal action brilliantly. The temporary restraining orders had been granted the following Friday morning after an emergency hearing where Rachel had testified about her forensic findings, and Lawrence had presented the documented evidence. Judge Thornton had been a no-nonsense jurist with 26 years on the bench who'd seen countless trade secret cases. She'd reviewed the key exhibits, listened to Rachel's testimony, and had ruled that the evidence showed clear misappropriation and breach of confidentiality obligations. She'd issued orders preventing all 6 defendants from using any confidential information, contacting any clients or prospective clients of our company, or operating Apex Strategic Solutions pending a full preliminary injunction hearing. The orders had effectively shut down their entire plan. They couldn't contact the clients they'd been planning to poach. They couldn't use the strategies and methodologies they'd copied. They couldn't even operate their business using the structure they'd created. Everything had ground to a halt. The preliminary injunction hearing 3 weeks later had been even more comprehensive. Lawrence had presented our full case with exhibits, testimony from Rachel about the digital forensics, testimony from me about the confidential nature of our business strategies, and testimony from our CEO about the competitive harm. My former team had hired a defense attorney named Gordon Whitfield, who'd tried to argue that the information they'd taken was just general industry knowledge and not trade secrets. Lawrence had systematically destroyed that argument by showing the specific proprietary frameworks we'd developed, the client relationship details they'd copied, and the explicit planning documents where they'd discussed using our confidential information to compete. Judge Thornton had ruled in our favor on every claim. She'd issued a preliminary injunction that would remain in effect pending trial, preventing them from using any of the information they'd taken and from operating their competing business. She'd also ordered them to return all confidential materials and submit to forensic examination of their personal devices to ensure everything had been deleted. The ruling had been devastating for them. Apex Strategic Solutions couldn't operate. They couldn't contact clients. They couldn't use any of the strategies they'd planned to build their business on. They were effectively dead in the water. The case had settled 6 months later before going to trial. My former team simply didn't have the resources to fight a prolonged litigation against our company's legal firepower. They'd agreed to a settlement that included permanent injunctions, preventing them from using any confidential information, prohibiting them from contacting our clients for 5 years, requiring them to formally dissolve Apex Strategic Solutions, and paying $250,000 in damages and legal fees. The money had been split among them based on their partnership percentages, meaning Stephanie had owed $75,000, Kyle had owed $62,000, and the others had owed smaller amounts. None of them had that kind of cash, so they'd agreed to payment plans that would take them years to complete. More importantly, the settlement had included admissions that they'd breached their confidentiality agreements and employment obligations. Those admissions had gone into public court records and had destroyed their professional reputations. Word had spread quickly through our industry about what had happened. The case had been covered in trade publications. Other companies had been warned about hiring any of them. Their LinkedIn profiles had been flooded with comments. They'd become toxic in the professional community. Stephanie had ended up taking a position at a small regional firm, making about 60% of what she'd been earning with us. Kyle had moved to a different state, trying to escape his reputation. Trent had left the industry entirely and had gone to work for his father's construction business. Vanessa had found work doing customer service for a call center. Nicole had gone back to school. Justin had taken a job in retail management. None of them had recovered their careers. The betrayal and the legal consequences had marked them permanently. Meanwhile, I'd rebuilt my team with people who understood loyalty and professional ethics. I'd hired 3 experienced professionals who'd brought fresh perspectives and hadn't needed the extensive training my former team had required. Within 6 months, we'd not only replaced the departed team members, but had exceeded our previous performance metrics. The division had grown to $53 million in annual revenue. None of our clients had left. The attempted poaching had failed completely because the relationships had been built on my foundation, not my former team's individual connections. The clients had respected me for handling the situation professionally and had actually deepened their commitments to our company. My promotion to VP had continued to flourish. The equity stake had become valuable as the company had grown. I'd been invited to speak at industry conferences about building and protecting high-performing teams. The story of how I'd discovered and stopped the theft had become a case study in corporate security and employee management. I'd turned a betrayal into a professional victory. About a year after the settlement, I'd run into Stephanie at an industry event. She'd looked older, tired, diminished. She'd tried to apologize, saying she'd gotten caught up in the excitement of starting something new and hadn't thought through the ethical implications. I'd listened politely and had told her the apology was appreciated, but unnecessary. I didn't need her apology. I'd needed her to face consequences, and she had. That was enough. The hardest part of the entire experience hadn't been the betrayal itself. It had been the 3 months of pretending I didn't know while watching them plan to destroy everything I'd built. Sitting in meetings, giving feedback, sharing strategies, all while knowing they were stealing from me. But that difficulty had been worth it, because it had allowed me to build an unassailable case and deliver justice that stuck. Looking back at that moment in the restaurant when Stephanie had stood up to announce their resignation and I'd stood up to reveal I'd known all along, I'd felt the same cold clarity I'd felt reading Rachel's initial forensic report. This was wrong. This was theft. And the only way to stop it was to be strategic, gather evidence, and strike with overwhelming force at exactly the right moment. Some people had asked me later why I'd chosen to reveal everything at the dinner rather than letting them resign quietly and then suing them. The answer was simple. They'd chosen that dinner to make their announcement because they'd thought it would box me in professionally. They'd thought I wouldn't make a scene at my own promotion celebration. By flipping that expectation and making it the moment of their exposure rather than my constraint, I'd taken away their psychological advantage and demonstrated that I controlled the narrative, not them. The public nature of the revelation at the dinner hadn't been about drama. It had been about establishing immediately and undeniably that I'd known about their plan, had gathered evidence, and had prepared a legal response. It had prevented any possibility of them claiming later that the lawsuit was a surprise or that they hadn't known they were doing anything wrong. 24 witnesses had heard me lay out the evidence and the legal action. There was no ambiguity, no room for spin. I'd lost a team, but I'd kept my integrity, my division, and my professional reputation. Those 3 things were worth infinitely more than 6 employees who'd never really been loyal. Sometimes the right response to betrayal isn't immediate confrontation or emotional reaction. Sometimes it's cold, strategic documentation, followed by devastating legal action at the moment of maximum impact. And sometimes the sweetest justice is watching people who underestimated you realize exactly how wrong they were. They'd thought I was too nice, too trusting, too focused on the work to notice their planning. They'd thought I'd be helpless once they left. They'd learned otherwise. The company I'd built my career with had learned something too. They'd seen that I could handle a major crisis with strategy and professionalism, that I could protect company interests even when it meant taking hard action against people I'd worked with closely, that I had the judgment and the backbone for executive leadership. The betrayal had actually accelerated my career progression because I'd demonstrated skills that can't be taught in business school. Within 18 months of the settlement, I'd been promoted again to senior vice president with responsibility for 3 divisions. The team that had tried to destroy me had actually created the opportunity for me to rise higher than I might have otherwise. Poetic justice in its finest form. If you made it this far, hit like. You've earned it.